It's one of the pivotal conflicts of the 2020s, a 4-year war that's brought the nation of Myanmar to its knees. According to conflict trackers, the death toll has crept past 80,000, with the true number of dead probably a whole lot higher than that. Millions upon millions have been displaced. A network of allied rebel groups has had an incredible success against an authoritarian military regime, and a resolution to the conflict in either direction will come with implications for the entire world. So why is it that after 4 years of open warfare, Myanmar civil conflict is practically ignored on the international stage? Why, in a world fixated on wars in Ukraine and Gaza, has the situation in Myanmar failed to capture the interest of all but the most hardcore of geopolitics observers? Of which you're more than likely one. Hello there. Well, as it turns out, we can answer that question. In fact, there's not just one, but a few good reasons that Myanmar's civil war is so terribly difficult to follow, why the ebb and flow of the conflict resists expectations, and thus far, why it comes with a lack of an ending that's, shall we say, narratively satisfying? Take a look at Myanmar without context, without layer after layer of explanation, and the state of the conflict today hardly makes sense at all. But it's by digging into the complexity of Myanmar's civil war that we can understand just why the conflict's so important, with ripple effects that spread not just across Southeast Asia, but across the whole globe. Now, the first, and perhaps the most obvious reason that Myanmar's civil war flies under the radar is because over the course of the last year, it's turned into the sort of conflict where everything seems to be happening all at once, but at the same time, it's as if nothing is happening at all. Wind back the clock about a year and a half, and the civil war in Myanmar was among the most dynamic on the globe, with dozens of insurgencies fighting the government and their local allies on countless fronts simultaneously. But while, in a manner of speaking, that is still what's going on today, the pace of territorial conquest by either side has slowed to an absolute crawl. Part of the reason why the pace of fighting has slowed down, well, that can be traced back to a catastrophic earthquake earlier this year, one that captured international headlines but was explained as a natural disaster that just happened to take place amidst a civil conflict that was sort of hand-waved away when it was mentioned in global media coverage. The quake is believed to have killed about 5,500 people in Myanmar, with hundreds still missing at the time of writing, and it forced rebels and government soldiers alike to put a temporary freeze on the conflict. The earthquake led to a major humanitarian crisis in both regime-controlled and rebel-controlled areas, and although the regime continued intermittent airstrikes against rebel targets even in the aftermath, the earthquake provided both sides with good reason to put on their best face and stop the fighting. For the rebels, the earthquake was a chance to show that they could govern the territories they controlled, organize relief efforts, and work with international humanitarian organizations without the internationally recognized government's help. For the regime, it was a chance to insist to the world that the military under Min Aung Hlaing was still the only group that could coordinate a disaster response, and it was a chance to get Hlaing himself back into contact with world leaders who had previously been doing their best to ignore him. Although some offensives continued in areas where the earthquake's effects had been minimal, large parts of the conflict were put on pause in March of 2025, and by the time the fighting restarted, the surge of international media attention in Myanmar moved elsewhere. But the earthquake is only a part of the story, and really the conflict had already been in the process of slowing down before the quake hit. You see, the Myanmar civil war isn't like most wars around the world. It's not fought between two or more neatly defined armed forces, or between an armed force and a unified insurgency. Instead, it's fought between Myanmar's ruling military regime, the Tatmadaw, and dozens upon dozens of ethnic militias who joined forces with pro-democracy freedom fighters. But although Myanmar's tapestry of insurgent groups is a part of why this conflict is so overlooked, in ways we'll explain shortly, it's the history of those insurgent groups that we need to discuss first. Myanmar has never not been at war since it gained its independence, with a handful of ethnic militia fighting the governments at literally every point in the country's history. Because of that, the Tatmadaw is a military that's not built to win wars abroad, but to keep control over the full scope of Myanmar's insurgent groups at home. To do that, the Tatmadaw has spent decades ordering itself into a sort of pyramid structure, one that viewers who've watched our prior coverage on the conflict can probably recall. At the bottom of the pyramid, the Tatmadaw built and maintained hundreds of small outposts all across the country, sometimes with no more than a dozen soldiers and a couple of pickup trucks with machine guns bolted onto them. Then, the next level up the pyramid, the Tatmadaw maintained small bases scattered across the countryside, watching over individual towns or small geographical areas. Those small bases, in turn, were managed by major regional command centers, large bases with enough troops that if a flare-up was reported in a given area, they could respond with overwhelming force. And finally, at the top of the pyramid were the Tatmadaor's largest land and air bases, as well as the forces stationed in its three biggest cities, Yangon, Mandalay, and the capital city of Naypyidaw. Now, we explained the structure of the Tatmadaor across the country because that structure has quite literally shaped the ongoing civil war from the time that it began following a Tatmadaor takeover of the country in 2021. Ever since the nation's freedom fighters and its ethnic militias joined forces, and especially since the start of a unified campaign called Operation 1027 in late 2023, the rebels have gotten better and better at defeating more and more heavily fortified targets. First, they learned to overrun the small outposts, eventually doing so with such effectiveness that Tatmadaor troops stopped even trying to defend them. Then they proved that they could overrun the small bases that kept watch over towns and villages. Then they worked their way up to the strength that they could start taking out regional command centers. To reuse an analogy that we've used before on this channel for fans of the Far Cry video game series, it's basically Far Cry, specifically Far Cry 4. For a while, the surging momentum of the rebels was impossible to miss. Outposts were falling by the day, townships were being taken over in rapid succession, and the rural parts of Myanmar were falling completely under rebel control. Even today, the Tatmadaor maintains secure control of less than 20% of Myanmar's overall territory, in a reflection of just how effective the rebels have been in the countryside. But unfortunately for the rebels, it was inevitable that they'd eventually hit a wall, and now in 2025, that's precisely what's happened. By pushing the Tatmadaor into such a small proportion of Myanmar's territory and forcing them to concentrate their forces in cities and towns that they can't really afford to lose, the rebels have gotten them out of most of the country. But they've also made the military's remaining emplacements much harder to bring down. Although Myanmar's rebels have benefited from a steady influx of small arms and explosives and have taken to 21st century technology like consumer-grade drones with great effect, they still lack the heavy equipment that would be required to assault a fortified target. They have no air power to try and face the Tatmadaor in the sky, and many of the ethnic militias have already secured most of the territory they really care about, meaning that their fighters are far less likely to risk their lives in difficult battles halfway across the country. The simple realities of force concentration mean that with fewer targets to defend, the Tatmadaor can place far greater numbers of troops at each point, while their geographical constraints actually make the Tatmadaor's air force more effective, since it doesn't have to fly so far or cover as many battle zones at once. As a result, the pace and intensity of rebel combat operations have slowed down substantially. There are still battles ongoing in some areas. In the latter half of July, the Tatmadaor managed to capture a couple of towns, and the Battle of Barmo, an intense fight over the northern Barmo township, shows no signs of stopping anytime soon. But whether towns or villages pass from rebel to military control or are exchanged in the opposite direction, those changes are not happening frequently. Instead, much of the fighting right now takes place in the form of small skirmishes, as rebels and Tatmadaor soldiers launch hit-and-run raids on each other's convoys and outposts. Some of the fighting takes place along roads, as the military or rebels move at a snail's pace toward each other's fortified territory. And the next stage of targets that would continue the rebels' progress up the pyramid of Tatmadaor military installations are just too difficult to crack with the equipment that the rebels have. Take it from us here at WarFronts, it can be hard to find a way to talk about ongoing conflicts that are at a constant simmer with no real inflection points to turn into a headline. As for why the global media is ignoring Myanmar now, well, that's actually a pretty decent place to start. And just before we do get started there, I'd like to give a plug to our fantastic twice-weekly newsletter, which keeps you right up to date with everything going on in the world. I mean, when it comes to conflict, not everything going on in the world, that would be a hell of a newsletter. I think they call them newspapers. But our newsletter, you can sign up to it below. It's 100% free. We think you'll like it. If you like this channel, you'll like it. Go subscribe. Why not? It's free. Thousands of people, tens of thousands of people already do, which is nice. Thank you, guys. And let's carry on, because next we're going to talk about from the pace and trajectory of the current fighting, we also get some insight into another factor that makes the Myanmar civil war so difficult to report on and so easy to ignore. And that's that there are so many bloody factions. Myanmar's rebel alliance includes dozens of ethnic militias hailing from dozens of ethnic groups. the Kachin, the Karen, the Karenni, the Mon, the Taang, and many, many, many others. Memorize all of them, and you've only accounted for half the resistance. The other half is made up of the People's Defense Force, pro-democracy rebels that seek to bring down the Tatmadaw and reinstate Myanmar's civil government, and who've chosen to ally themselves with the ethnic militias in order to do so. Nor are the ethnic militias always fighting against the government. We refer to the Tatmadaw as if it's some sort of monolith, but they too fight alongside their own patchwork of loyalist militias, often turning members of the same ethnic groups against each other. And all of that before we even start talking about the Wa, who are simultaneously a fascinating and highly relevant group, and also a third faction controlled by China who just complicate everything that much more. As a result, it can be very difficult to have nuanced conversations about the war in Myanmar because in order to talk about it through mass media, you've either got to explain the details of the situation to a layman audience like we do here at WarFronts, you're so welcome, or you've got to exclusively talk about narratives that fall easily into a rebels versus regime dichotomy without any need for additional nuance. Again, it was easy enough for global media to discuss the war as rebels against regime and leave it at that when the rebels were all surging together and taking over massive swaths of territory. But it's more complicated now, in a phase of the war when the rebels are pursuing their own goals, operating in ways that are largely disconnected from each other and at times disengaging from conversations on the future of a unified Myanmar, especially in the cases of ethnic militias who feel as if they've achieved all their major objectives. On dedicated channels like this one, like WarFronts, where an unusually high proportion of viewers have at least a passing familiarity with the conflict, and where you intelligent, lovely bastards are interested in sitting through a detailed explanation of what's happening, there are still lots of interesting things to talk about. But for the average media outlet, trying to cover all the ins and outs of a conflict without many major inflection points, it's just a massive headache. And complicating matters even further is the fact that Myanmar's civil war is even tougher to frame in terms of good guys and bad guys than your average armed conflict. While no side in a war is ever completely good or innocent, it's one thing when the world is rooting for a scrappy underdog like Ukraine in a desperate stand against a far more powerful invader. It's quite another when readers or viewers who have spent enough time to learn about Myanmar's various rebel groups have to confront the reality that those rebels are, to put it really nicely, complicated actors. Many of Myanmar's ethnic militias protect communities that have gotten by for decades courtesy of the drug trade, growing opium that then makes up a high share of the world's heroin consumption. Complicated actors. Many others are involved in illicit enterprises like arms smuggling or the manufacture of addictive methamphetamine pills. Complicated actors. Some rebel factions have a hand in massive scam centers where people are trafficked in from other nations and forced to work in modern slavery conditions to carry out complex scams on victims all across the globe. Or say it again. Complicated actors. The rebel Arakan army is one of the most successful and powerful ethnic militias, and they've even carried out mass killings and atrocities against Myanmar's Muslim Rohingya population, furthering the Rohingya genocide that's been ongoing since 2016. Even Aung San Suu Kyi, once a globally recognized avatar for the idea of peace and democracy in Myanmar, has endured a brutal fall from grace before being taken into indefinite detention by the Tatmadaw, meaning that in her literal and rhetorical absence, there's no clear figure for pro-rebel advocates to rally behind. To be clear, the fact that Myanmar's rebels are engaged in these sorts of illicit enterprises or atrocities does not mean that the military regime is any better. Not only has the regime overseen and organized drug production and smuggling of its own, protected and perpetrated scam centers in its own territory, and carried out its own fair share of the Rohingya genocide, but it's also made a reputation for indiscriminately bombing schools and hospitals, perpetuating systemic sexual abuse of women and girls, and routinely engaging in torture and extrajudicial executions. But any close look at the Myanmar civil war reveals a state of affairs where there are very few pure, unadulterated good guys for international audiences to root for. That's not to diminish the ultimate goals of Myanmar's rebel alliance to overthrow a murderous regime and restore peace and democracy across the nation, but to understand the civil war with any level of complexity is to understand that there's far more to the story than that. Now, beyond the slowing pace of the war, beyond the moral complexity of Myanmar's rebel groups, a major part of the reason why Myanmar's civil war is so ignored is because of the absolutely gargantuan elephant in the room, China. As we'll explain, China's involvement in the conflict in Myanmar is fascinating from an academic perspective, but the sheer weight of Beijing's presence has an important impact on how the conflict is perceived. If there ever was a war around the world that is clearly in China's sphere of influence, it is this ongoing conflict in Myanmar. The nation shares a long land border with China. It's awash in Chinese interests and infrastructural projects. It plays host to an autonomous region that's under China's direct control, and it's so close to China that it would be foolhardy for any other world power to come in and try to be a counterweight. The United States, for instance, might decide to turn a civil war in a small developing nation into a proxy conflict with China if that civil war was located somewhere in Africa or Latin America or the Middle East. But to attempt that same thing in Myanmar, it's just not worth investing that much into a conflict that would clearly be a losing battle. The fact that China has such a clear monopoly on the Myanmar conflict has knock-on effects for the way the conflict is covered in Western media. After all, if American or European countries don't really have a stake in the conflict, then it's far less likely to be reported on compared to conflicts like Ukraine or Gaza, where Western audiences do feel that they've got skin in the game. Add to that the fact that China's role in the Myanmar conflict isn't nearly so cut and dry as you'd expect from a major power, as that major power puts a finger on the scale of a civil war. To put it simply, China doesn't care who wins the civil war in Myanmar, at least not because of any particular affection or disdain for either side. China has made a habit of funneling smuggled arms shipments to the rebels through their proxy administration in Wa State, greatly enhancing their ability to fight and contributing to some of their most important breakthroughs to date. At the same time, they've also supported the Tatmadaw, both in its war effort and on the international stage. China seemed to support a Tatmadaw offensive in one area while seeming to favor a rebel offensive in another, and often they just won't weigh in at all, or at least not in a way that international observers can actually see. China's interests in the Myanmar conflict are entirely self-serving. China relies on mining operations in Myanmar to harvest a large proportion of Beijing's rare earth minerals, which are then refined and either used or sold off through Chinese companies in an area where China has worked hard to corner the global market. Those rare earth metals are then fed through global supply chains, fueling electronics all across the world, and if those supply flows were to be disrupted, then the Myanmar civil war could very quickly become a global problem. But it's in China's interests to ensure that such a thing doesn't happen and to ensure that the rest of the world never feels any real pressure to get involved. China runs a massive pipeline across Myanmar, transporting fuel from a port on the Indian Ocean. That pipeline provides a backdoor where, in a hypothetical war, China could continue receiving fuel even if access to all of its own ports has been blockaded. Thousands of Chinese civilians run lucrative businesses and live their lives out of Myanmar, especially Yangon and Mandalay, while Chinese investment has poured into the country for decades and especially in the last few years. So when China does seek to influence the conflict, it tends to impress a single crystal clear message on all the participants. Don't you dare touch our and both the Tatmadaw and the rebels know full well that they would be wise to respect Beijing's demands. On multiple occasions in the last few months, rebel factions have outright abandoned major towns, and they've sacrificed hundreds of lives to capture simply because China made clear that it would prefer for those towns to be under the Tatmadaw's control, in each case to establish clear zones of control around that critical pipeline or other important infrastructure assets. Speaking of that pipeline, it's now become a favored destination for displaced families who make a habit of setting up camp as close to the pipeline as they possibly can, knowing that all sides in the conflict will do everything possible to avoid hitting it. When a rebel faction attempted to pressure China by taking control of rare earth mines, China sent their proxy forces in Wa State to go and protect a potential mining zone and set up round-the-clock operations to build replacement mines instead of having to deal with the rebels on less than ideal terms. And as for taking the bigger cities, where hundreds or even thousands of Chinese nationals preside over Chinese business interests, well, in a way, it's almost a good thing that the rebels can't muster the strength to take those cities by force. If they could, then they'd face an impossible choice. Either spurn China's expectations and attack, possibly drawing China into the conflict directly and, at the very least, making an enemy, or sit on their hands and leave the cities untouched, knowing that they could overthrow the Tatmadaw if only the big boss next door would allow it. China doesn't favor the rebels, and it doesn't favor the Tatmadaw, but it does favor stability. Fighting near Chinese interests is bad for business, and right now, at this late stage in the conflict, the Tatmadaw's positions tend to place them on or around some of the most important Chinese interests of all. From China's perspective, it's not that the rebels don't have reason to attack the Tatmadaw, it's that the rebels just happen to be out of luck. Like all things in the Myanmar conflict, China's role is complicated. It resists simple explanations, but it's deeply relevant to the conflict and its eventual outcome in a way that tends to become a real barrier when people across the globe take a passing interest in the war. Now, of course, there's one more reason that the world tends to ignore Myanmar's civil war, and it's a reason that we've hinted at again and again throughout this episode. Myanmar's ongoing active but static stalemate, its disparate and somewhat disconnected rebel alliance, and the specifics of China's involvement in the country all lend themselves to a frustrating broader reality. Right now, there's no clear resolution in sight, and we don't just mean that neither side seems close to victory or even seems to have much momentum. It's that there doesn't even seem to be many paths to end the war in anybody's favour, meaning that it's difficult to articulate what either side's realistic goals are, what they have any hope of achieving, or what Myanmar could look like after the war concludes. Let's compare this to the conflict in Ukraine, where, at least in broad strokes, we can name a few possibilities about how the war could end. Russia could completely take over Ukraine, or Ukraine could completely push Russia off its territory. Neither outcome seems very likely. Instead, the likeliest resolution will probably leave Ukraine's territory split in some way, possibly by dividing up provinces between Ukraine and Russia, or possibly by declaring a freeze to the conflict and dividing territory along the front lines, wherever they happen to be placed when the war concludes. After that, there are questions about Ukraine's membership in NATO, any restrictions on rearmaments that Russia can impose, the potential for Russia to just turn around and invade Ukraine again, and all sorts of other factors that we can at least try and game out in a theoretical sense. In Myanmar, though, those clear-cut options, they just don't exist. Right now, there's very little chance of the Tatmadaw being able to rally and take back any significant portion of its lost territory by force, let alone unifying all of Myanmar under the military regime. At the same time, there's very little chance that the rebels could both gather the strength and get the requisite clearance from China to go and topple the Tatmadaw where it's at its strongest. The rebel government in exile, the National Unity Government, is very unlikely to ever find enough common ground with the Tatmadaw to work out a common solution, and no foreign power is likely to enter the conflict and push back against China's dominion anytime soon. And even if a peace was agreed, it would be highly unlikely, not to mention completely ahistorical, for all of Myanmar's many ethnic militias to agree simultaneously to just end the fighting. Remember, when we said earlier that Myanmar has never not been at war, we meant it. Since it gained independence in 1948, Myanmar has always dealt with isolated conflicts against its own people at a bare minimum. Whether it's the Tatmadaw that's hypothetically going to win the war, or whether the National Unity Government could reinstall a civil administration, there would always be someone, somewhere, looking to carry on the fight. So what does an end to this war actually look like? In a realistic best-case scenario, it probably ends with some kind of informal partition, with the Tatmadaw keeping control of the cities and the south-central portion of the country, while individual ethnic groups try and go about governing their own territory with no standing on the international stage, no ability to formally work with global humanitarian groups or world governments, and no real sense of unity between them, even if the National Unity Government or a successor organization can represent the rebels as a collective. Simply put, even the best-case scenario for Myanmar is a mess, with little hope of true unity and no viable path for the country's rebel alliance to declare a real victory. So, why is the world ignoring Myanmar's civil war? Because it's complicated, it's really, really complicated, and it's evolving in a way that resists any easy comprehension. It's manipulated by a more powerful neighbour, but not always in the ways that the global public is accustomed to, and not in a way that lends itself to a clear resolution in either side's favour. The war does have the potential to impact the entire world, especially if the flow of critical minerals from Myanmar were to be cut off. But China goes to great lengths to reassure itself and the rest of the world that there's nothing to see in Myanmar's jungles. The war does have a rebel alliance, but those rebels have some serious skeletons in their closets, and although they aren't necessarily destined to lose, it's very difficult to see a future when they can really win. As painful as it may be to acknowledge, some conflicts, they're sexier than others. In a modern world that runs on engagement, clicks, and watch time, so familiar with that, and where the world has to decide which conflicts to cover and which conflicts to highlight and raise global awareness for, Myanmar apparently just isn't sexy enough to make the cut. It's not fair, and dare we say it, it's not right. But sometimes it's how these things go. And I guess we just did our little part. Thank you for watching.